This is the first of 2 short tutorials to help you with the skills you'll need to determine portion cost using a standardized recipe. After viewing this screencast, my hope is that you'll be able to explain the relationship between standardized recipes and cost control, and to distinguish between AP and EP when determining recipe costs, as well as being able to create a recipe cost calculation. As you remember, the essential parts of a standardized recipe are reviewed here. There's more that can be included, but with this information on a recipe that has been tested and yield has been determined, the cost per recipe or per portion can be calculated. The recipes you're costing are volume or quantity recipes that have not been standardized. So if standardized in an actual operation, there might be variations in ingredients and yields that will cause variations in cost. But for purposes of learning the costing techniques, these recipes will be useful in their current form. The standardized recipe is useful and necessary for all of the reasons that are included here. Imagine the significance of a creative chef that improvises by adding soy sauce to a recipe that's labeled gluten-free, or substitutes butter instead of olive oil for an item labeled milk or dairy-free. Download the recipe cost template from the Costing Resources folder in PolyLearn. Print and enter by hand or use Excel to list every ingredient with a brief description. You can create your own spreadsheet if you prefer, as long as the same basic information is included. I'm using the broccoli slaw we made for open house as a model, since you're all familiar with that recipe, and it includes some produce where an AP to EP calculation must be done. Enter EP or AP in the appropriate column, depending on how the recipe reads. Most ingredients will be given in EP amounts. Notice this example does the AP to EP conversion for you for the meat, but not for the potatoes, carrots, onions, or celery. Enter EP or AP in the appropriate column, depending on how the recipe reads. Most ingredients will be given in EP amounts. Notice this example does the AP to EP conversion for you for the meat. But not for the potatoes, carrots, onions, or celery. You'll have to purchase or requisition more than the amounts required based on the yield for each of these vegetables. Here's a clear example of the difference between an AP product, whole fresh oranges, and EP oranges, peeled and cut into chunks, or bite-sized pieces. The Book of Yields reports the yield for fresh 72-count navel oranges to be 62.5%. Or another way to look at this is 100 pounds of fresh whole oranges will yield about 62.5 pounds of ready-to-eat orange pieces. These are the onions we prepared for open house. According to Food for 50, the yield is 88%. The Book of Yields reports 91%. So for large users of onions, the 3 pounds per 100 of whole product might make it worthwhile to do their own yield calculation, considering the usual product they receive and the usual practices of their staff. Next on your template, enter the amount of each ingredient that the recipe calls for in pounds and ounces. If given by volume, use the table in Food for 50 titled Food Weights and Approximate Equivalents in Measures, Table 4.2. This was helpful for the small amounts of salt, white pepper, and dry mustard that were in our recipe in teaspoons. The white pepper amount in our recipe for 390 servings of broccoli slaw is 7.5 teaspoons. Using table 4.2 in Food for 50, I can see that 1 ounce of ground pepper, black or white, is equivalent to a volume of 4 tablespoons. To convert the volume in teaspoons to ounces, determine the weight of 1 teaspoon. 0.083 ounces, multiply by 0.7. Here's an example of how to use the tables to do a conversion from a volume measure to weight. The white pepper amount in our recipe for 390 servings of broccoli slaw is 7.5 teaspoons. Using table 4.2 in Food for 50, I can see that 1 ounce of ground pepper, black or white, is equivalent to a volume of 4 tablespoons. To convert the volume in teaspoons to ounces, determine the weight of 1 teaspoon, which you do by dividing. First convert to teaspoons, then divide by 12, and you come up with this 0.083 ounces per teaspoon. Multiply by 7.5 for a total of 0.623 ounces. I'm going to round to 0.65, and you may actually decide, if you were standardizing this recipe, to even round up a little more or round down more to arrive at an amount that is a little easier to work with. But again, if you have a digital scale, this isn't a problem. Then, from the grocery order guide, you can see that white pepper is $161.30 for a case of 6 18-ounce packages. Right there. And this is from the Cisco order guide, grocery order guide. Multiply 6 times 18 for the total number of ounces per case. Then, to get the price per ounce, divide 161.30 by 108 ounces for a result of $1.49 per ounce. Multiply that by 0.65 ounces for an ingredient cost for this recipe of 0.97 cents. I skipped ahead to cost calculation on the previous slide to walk you all the way through that particular ingredient. After converting all volume measures to weights, then enter the yield for each ingredient. Many of your ingredients will have a 100% yield, like flour, sugar, salt, oil, and others. However, produce and meat will usually be purchased in a form that will have some preparation or trimming losses, so be sure to refer to one of the references suggested. Most whole, fresh foods will have a yield percentage less than 100%. You'll be able to rely on the yield resources in Food for 50, the Food Service Guide to Fresh Produce, the Book of Yields, or the Chef's Book of Formulas, Yields, and Sizes. These resources are based on industry averages and are completely acceptable for most recipe planning and analysis. However, operations can conduct their own yield calculations, which, similar to the process of standardizing a recipe, are finalized using the products, equipment, and employee methods and skills typical in a particular setting. Butcher's tests are similar measurements of meat as purchased with trim that reflects the standards of the system. And cooking loss tests take food to the next step, measuring the shrinkage that occurs in many foods as moisture is lost in the cooking process. For ingredients that are purchased in the edible portion form, the amount to purchase will be the same as the amount the recipe calls for. Amount to requisition is probably a better description, since usually the ingredient is purchased in bulk. The white pepper is a good example, purchased in a case of 6 18-ounce containers for about $161, yet the amount used for the recipe has a cost of about $1. Fresh produce and meat will usually need to be purchased or requisitioned in an amount larger than what's needed for the recipe to allow for preparation or trimming losses. In this example, the broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, and green onions each have a yield less than 100%. The as-purchased quantity is determined by dividing the EP, or edible portion amount, by the yield, as shown in the cauliflower example. Early in the process, search the produce, meat, grocery, and dairy order guides for each of the ingredients on the recipe that you selected. If not included, email me as soon as possible so that I can request prices. Then review the other materials in PolyLearn. 2 copies of Food for 50 and 1 copy of the Chef's Book of Formulas and Yields is on 2-hour reserve in the library, so working in the library or copying the necessary tables might be a good idea. I'll break here and we'll resume with the second screencast soon. Thanks.